There is a specific sound that metal makes when it tears, a high-pitched scream that sounds like a dying animal. And when that sound is the front bumper of a pristine, white luxury sedan grinding against the hardened steel of a 12-ton corn harvester, it's a sound that stays with you forever. I sat there, high up in the cab of my machine, phone in hand, watching this absolute train wreck of a human being destroy her own life in real time. And all I could think about was my grandfather, the man who cleared this land by hand, the man who told me that patience isn't just a virtue, it's a weapon. She thought she was fighting a simple dirt kicker, a man she could bully into submission with clipboards and homeowners association bylaws. But Linda Sterling didn't realize that when you pick a fight with a farmer, you're not just fighting a man, you're fighting the seasons, the soil, and 80 years of stubborn survival. Let me take you back to where the rot started, before the police lights and the federal indictments. Back when it was just a fence line and a whole lot of audacity. My name is Caleb Thorne, and I run Thorne Legacy Farms, 300 acres of prime grain nestled in a valley that used to be nothing but trees and silence until the developers came. They carved up the adjacent pasture, poured concrete over the wildflowers, and erected Willow Creek Heights, a subdivision of cookie-cutter mansions for people who want the aesthetic of the country without the smell of manure or the noise of production. Enter Linda, 50-something, former corporate vice president of something vague but important, and the self-appointed queen bee of the Willow Creek HOA. She drove a pearl-white Mercedes GLS, wore designer sunglasses that probably cost more than my weekly fuel budget, and looked at my fields like they were a stain on her perfect panoramic view. The war began over a dirt strip, a simple access road my family has used since 1938 to get our equipment to the back 40, a road that legally predates her subdivision, her house, and her entire existence. It started on a Tuesday, the air thick with the smell of diesel and morning dew. I was greasing the bearings on the planter when I heard the crunch of gravel and the click-clack of heels that had no business being on unpaved ground. She marched up to me, clipboard held like a shield, nostrils flared as if the very air around me was offensive. "Mr. Thorne," she announced, voice dripping with that specific kind of suburban condescension, "this ends today. Your heavy machinery is degrading the aesthetic value of our common area entrance. You need to use the highway route." The highway route meant a 6-mile detour through heavy commuter traffic, moving a machine wider than a single lane. It was suicide, and she knew it. I tried to be polite, I really did, telling her that the easement was deeded in the 30s, but she just waved a hand and dropped the classic line, "I have connections at the county, and we will not tolerate this industrial blight." That was the moment the gloves came off, though she didn't know it yet, because while she was screaming about aesthetics, I was thinking about logistics. She started a campaign of petty terror, sitting in a folding chair right at the edge of my easement every single morning at 5 a.m., holding a decibel meter and a camera, documenting my existence like I was a rare, invasive species. My wife, Elena, a woman with the patience of a saint but the protective instinct of a grizzly bear, found me in the shop one night staring at a cease and desist letter Linda had taped to our gate. "She wants a war, Caleb," Elena said, pouring me a coffee. "But she forgets that we don't fight with noise, we fight with paper." That was the epiphany, because while Linda was playing checkers with noise complaints and harassment, I decided to play 4D chess with property law. I went down to the county clerk's office, a place that smells like old dust and bureaucracy, and dug up the original plat maps from before World War II. The clerk, a sweet lady named Mrs. Higgins, helped me pull the files, and there it was, black on white, undeniable as gravity. My easement wasn't just the 12-foot dirt track I'd been using to be polite, it was a designated 30-foot right-of-way. The next morning, I hired Ted the Hawk Hawkins, the most precise surveyor in the tri-state area, to stake out the true property lines. I watched from the porch as Ted pounded those bright orange stakes into the ground, and the geometry of justice began to take shape. The line didn't just cover the road. It sliced right through Linda's prize-winning hydrangea bed and the elaborate "Welcome to Willow Creek" sign she had installed. When she came out screaming, wearing a silk robe and a face mask of pure fury, I was ready. "Mr. Thorne, what is the meaning of this vandalism?" she shrieked, pointing at the stakes that were currently impaling her flowers. "Just following the law, Linda," I said, leaning on the fence post. "Survey shows my easement is 30 feet. Looks like your landscaping is trespassing on active agricultural land. You might want to move that before harvest." The look on her face wasn't just anger. It was the glitching of a worldview that couldn't process being wrong. But Linda wasn't done, not by a long shot, because people like her don't de-escalate, they double down. She called an emergency HOA meeting, painting me as a rural terrorist who was weaponizing land rights to hurt families. And then she called the noise inspector, the health department, and even the school board to complain about Elena, who teaches at the local elementary school, claiming she was unfit due to her association with an environmental hazard. That was the mistake, bringing my family into it, threatening my wife's job because you don't like looking at a tractor. I realized then that this wasn't just a dispute, it was a siege, and if I wanted to survive, I had to stop just defending and start documenting. I installed high-definition cameras on every fence post, dash cams in every tractor, and started keeping a log that would make a ship captain jealous. She escalated to physical blockades, putting orange cones and road-closed signs up, claiming HOA authority over private property. When I moved them, she called the sheriff, Deputy Graves, a man who grew up baling hay and had zero patience for suburban nonsense. "Ma'am," Graves told her, standing in the dust of my driveway, "if you block a legal agricultural easement again, I'm not writing a ticket, I'm taking you to jail for interference with commerce." You'd think the threat of jail would stop her, but Linda was operating on a level of entitlement that defied logic. She took to social media, creating a group called Moms Against Farm Toxicity, posting photos of normal harvest dust and claiming it was carcinogenic particulate matter, whipping the new residents into a frenzy. It was psychological warfare, and I was losing sleep, watching my neighbors turn into enemies because one woman decided she was the main character of the universe. But the tide began to turn when Martha Higgins, the retired accountant who lived 3 doors down from Linda, came over for coffee one afternoon with a stack of papers that shook visibly in her hands. "Caleb," she whispered, looking over her shoulder like she expected a sniper, "I requested the HOA financials because the dues kept going up, and there are things here, things that don't add up." We sat at my kitchen table, the sun setting over the corn that was almost ready to harvest, and looked at the evidence of a crime in progress. Linda wasn't just harassing me for fun, she was billing the HOA for it. Consulting fees, paid to a shell company, legal retainers for lawyers that didn't exist, and thousands of dollars labeled security services that seemed to coincide perfectly with the day she sat in her lawn chair yelling at my tractor. "It's embezzlement," Elena said, her finger tracing the lines on the spreadsheet. "She's stealing from her own neighbors to fund a personal vendetta against us." The realization hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't just a Karen. She was a criminal, and she was unraveling. And that meant she was dangerous, because a cornered animal with nothing to lose and a god complex is the most unpredictable force on earth. I looked out the window at the darkening fields, knowing that harvest was a week away, and I just knew in my gut, that she was going to try something massive to stop me. I looked at Martha and Elena and said, "Let her keep going. Let her dig the hole so deep she can never climb out, because when she finally snaps, I want every single second of it on tape." We entered the eye of the storm, that strange, suffocating calm before the harvest begins, where the air is heavy with the scent of drying stalks and impending disaster. Linda Sterling had gone quiet, ominously quiet, the kind of silence that screams premeditation. My lawyer, a shark of a woman named Veronica Sharp, told us to hold the embezzlement evidence close to our chests. "Wait for the annual meeting," she advised, eyes gleaming. "Let her commit to the lie in front of everyone. But watch her back, because she's going to try to provoke a reaction before then." The provocation came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, captured in glorious 4K night vision by the cameras she thought she had blind-spotted. I watched the footage with my jaw on the floor. Linda, dressed like a cat burglar in a designer tracksuit, creeping around my fuel tanks, pouring gallons of what looked like sludge onto the ground. It wasn't diesel, though. It was synthetic motor oil, terrified to actually touch the dirty stuff. She was staging an environmental disaster to frame me. By sunrise, the circus had arrived. The EPA, the State Department of Natural Resources, and even a local news van, summoned by anonymous tips that undoubtedly came from a burner phone in Linda's purse. She was there, of course, performing for the cameras, wiping a fake tear, pointing at the oil slick and the dead fish she had scattered. Fish that, I later pointed out to the investigator, were saltwater species that had never seen an Ohio creek in their lives. The investigator, a no-nonsense guy from the state capitol, looked at the oil, looked at the fish, and then watched the security footage I silently handed him on a tablet. "Mr. Thorne," he said, voice low, "this is fraud, filing false reports, and environmental tampering. Do you want to press charges now?" I shook my head, thinking of the bigger picture. Not yet, let the file build, she's not done. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on the roofs of Willow Creek Heights. Marcus Trent, a reporter who had initially been skeptical of me, started digging into Linda's background and found the cracks in her facade, failed businesses, lawsuits in other states. Meanwhile, Martha Higgins found the smoking gun in the HOA insurance policy, the clause that voided all coverage if the board members used their personal vehicles for commercial or enforcement activities. And then came the day of the harvest. The sun rose blood red over the corn, the sky bruised with purple clouds, and I fired up the combine, a massive beast of a machine that roared like a dragon waking up. I turned onto the access road, my stomach in knots, knowing this was the final showdown. And there she was. She had parked her Mercedes GLS, a $90,000 SUV, directly across the 30-foot easement, blocking the only path to the lower fields. She was sitting inside, windows up, phone mounted on the dashboard, live streaming to her Facebook group, narrating her heroic stand against the agricultural villain. I stopped the combine 50 feet away, engine idling, the thrum of the machine vibrating through the ground. I called Deputy Graves, but Linda was already escalating. She saw me sitting there, not engaging, not screaming, just waiting, and it broke something inside her. She needed a villain, and I was refusing to play the part. So she decided to create the action she needed. On the video, which was being watched by dozens of her neighbors, you can see her eyes widen, a manic disconnect from reality, as she put the car in drive. She didn't back up. She didn't move aside. She floored it. She drove straight at the stationary combine, screaming something about intimidation for her audience, intending to stop just short, I assume, to create a dramatic thumbnail for her video. But she miscalculated the physics of a heavy luxury SUV on loose gravel. The sound was sickening, a crunch that you felt in your teeth. The Mercedes slid, lost traction, and slammed into the corn head of the harvester. The steel teeth of my machine, designed to shear through thousands of stalks an hour, didn't even flinch. Her hood crumpled like wet cardboard, the radiator exploded in a cloud of white steam, and the airbags detonated, filling the cabin with white powder. I sat there, frozen for a split second, before killing the engine and jumping down. She stumbled out of the wreckage, coughing, mascara running, pointing a shaking finger at me. He hit me. He attacked me with his tractor. You all saw it. She shrieked at her phone, which was lying face up on the passenger seat, still streaming to an audience that had just watched her drive into a parked vehicle. Deputy Graves pulled up seconds later, lights flashing, followed by half the neighborhood who had heard the crash. Linda ran to him, grabbing his uniform. Arrest him. Attempted murder. Graves gently peeled her off, looked at the skid marks, looked at the dashcam footage I was already queuing up, and then looked at the live stream on her phone. "Ma'am," Graves said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. The combine wasn't moving. "You drove into him." The color drained from her face, not because of the accident, but because the narrative, the carefully constructed lie she had lived in for months, had just shattered against the reality of steel and video evidence. And then, the tow truck arrived, dragging the wreckage of her car away, dragging her status symbol, her armor, leaving her exposed in the cold autumn air. But the true horror for her wasn't the crash. It was Martha Higgins walking up, flanked by Veronica Sharp, holding a copy of her lease agreement. "Linda," Martha said, voice shaking but clear, "since you were using the vehicle for unauthorized HOA enforcement activities, your insurance is void. And since you're being investigated for embezzlement, I don't think the HOA will be covering the damages either." Linda Sterling stood there, surrounded by the ruin of her own making, a totaled car, a looming criminal record, and a neighborhood that had finally woken up. I climbed back into my cab, the adrenaline fading into a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I turned the key, the engine roared back to life, and I drove past the spot where she stood, leaving her in the dust of the harvest she tried so hard to stop. The fallout wasn't immediate. It was a slow, crushing cascade, like watching a silo collapse in slow motion. The wreckage of the Mercedes was cleared, but the wreckage of Linda Sterling's life was just being laid out for inspection. The annual HOA meeting at the Willow Creek Community Center, usually a sparsely attended affair involving cookies and complaints about trash cans, turned into a standing-room-only event. They all came. The neighbors who had believed her lies, the ones who had been suspicious, and the quiet ones who just wanted to mow their lawns in peace. Linda showed up, out on bail for the reckless endangerment charge, looking like a ghost of her former self. She tried to take the podium, tried to bang the gavel and demand order, but the power had shifted. The room felt electric, charged with the collective anger of people who realized they'd been played. Martha Higgins stood up, not as a retired accountant, but as the executioner of fraud. She projected the spreadsheets onto the wall. The silence was deafening as the numbers illuminated the room. $35,000 stolen. Funneled into Robert Sterling's failing consulting firm. Used to pay for the surveillance of my farm. Used to lease the very car she had smashed into my combine. You paid for your own harassment, Martha told the room, her voice steady. Every time she fought Caleb, she was billing you for the privilege. The uproar was instantaneous. It wasn't just anger, it was betrayal. These people worked hard for their money, and seeing it squandered on a petty feud broke the spell Linda had cast. The vote to remove her from the board was unanimous. The vote to pursue full criminal prosecution? Also unanimous. But the piece de resistance came when the doors opened at the back of the hall. It wasn't local police this time. It was federal agents. Turns out, when you fake environmental disasters and file false reports about chemical terrorism regarding agricultural food supplies, the Department of Homeland Security takes a grim interest. Linda was let out in handcuffs, not screaming this time, but silent, finally understanding that the world outside her subdivision didn't care about her title or her connections. In the months that followed, justice was served cold and hard. Linda received 18 months in federal prison for the terrorism hoax and the fraud. Robert Sterling went down for conspiracy and money laundering. They lost the house, the cars, the reputation. The bank foreclosed on their McMansion, and I heard a nice young couple moved in. People who actually wave when I drive the tractor by. But the real victory wasn't her downfall. It was the community's uprising. The new HOA board, led by Martha, actually used the recovered funds to pave my access road properly, a peace offering that bridged the gap between the farm and the subdivision. We started holding farm-to-table nights, inviting the neighbors to see the harvest, to ride in the combines, to understand where their food comes from. I stood on my porch last night, watching the sun dip below the horizon, turning the stubble of the cornfields into gold. Elena stood beside me, holding my hand, the quiet restored to our valley. The scars on the harvester are still there, scratched paint and dented steel, a reminder of the battle we fought. It makes you wonder, though, in a world that is expanding so fast, where concrete is always hungry for more green space, who really owns the peace? Is it the person with the deed to the house, or the person whose sweat is mixed into the soil? Linda thought she could buy control, thought she could legislate nature into submission. She forgot that the land remembers, and the land always wins eventually. We didn't just win a court case, we protected a legacy. But it scares me to think about how many farmers out there don't have the cameras, the documentation, or the stubbornness to fight back. How many family farms have been swallowed up by the Lindas of the world because they were too polite to fight a war on their own doorstep? Justice was served here, but the hunger for land never sleeps. So, I keep the cameras running, I keep the deed in the safe, and I keep planting. Because the only thing necessary for the triumph of entitlement is for good men to do nothing. If this story got your blood boiling, or if you've ever had to fight for what's yours against someone who thought they knew better, hit that like button and subscribe. Let me know in the comments. Was the prison time enough, or did she get off easy? Until next time, keep your fences strong and your cameras rolling. Stay safe out there.